Hey everybody, it's Dave Isaacs for jamplay.com, and welcome to week 8 of creating melodies from scales. Today I want to talk about how we bring in notes that are not part of a scale in an improvisation that is solidly in a major key or in a particular key. A lot of people have a real misconception about this. If you're playing in the key of A, you have access to more than just the 7 notes of the A major scale. Now you have to have an idea of how to use them. When you do go outside the scale, there are particular ways to make those notes sound like they belong, regardless of what chord you're over. And it has a lot to do with understanding some of the things we've been talking about in the past, recognizing scale degrees, recognizing chord tones, and most of all, hearing the difference between notes that clash and notes that blend, notes that create tension that needs to be resolved, and notes that don't. If we're talking about being in a major key, one of the things you want to remember is that there is a key signature, there is a major scale that has particular notes in it, but to say we're in the key of A means more than just saying we're using A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A. That's part of it, yes. And here's that major scale, just to refresh your memory. We've been using this position a lot, so I'm in the 4th position. I'm starting on my 6th string at fret 5 with my middle finger, up the scale. And hopefully by now you're recognizing, okay, 2 octaves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. An octave here, the need to resolve. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Once again, the need to resolve. And then back. We've talked about how some of those notes blend in with particular chords. We talked about the chord scale last time and the idea of diatonic chords. So this is when we say we're in the key of A, that means that there's a particular set of chords that are going to be the most common and that work together most naturally to lead us through the sequence of the key of A. There is more than one sequence. There's lots of ways. At any given moment, you can choose to go lots of different directions. It's not like there are absolute rules of theory that tell you what chord you have to go to next. But there is definitely a sense of unfolding, of progression. I've talked about this before. Say we look at the chord progression that we've been using for our major key backing track in the key of A, which is a 1-chord A, a 2-chord B minor, a 4-chord D, and back to A. Now when I play that as a sequence, you should perceive it as kind of as a circle. We start somewhere, we move, we keep moving, tension has built. It's not like you can predict, not having heard it before, that from that 4-chord that we're going to go back to A. But you've got a pretty good idea that it's a possibility, whether you know it intellectually or not. You definitely know when you hear a chordal left turn, something that you didn't expect, as opposed to something that you did. This is very straightforward because it's meant to be. They're not supposed to be surprises here. 1 chord, meaning it's built on the first tone of the scale, A. 2 chord, meaning it's built on the second tone of the scale, B. It's a minor chord because if we take the notes of A major, as we established last week, if I start from a B and follow that formula of skip a letter to create a triad, using the notes that are in the key of A major, I get a B minor chord. And you'll find this for any major key. The 2 chord is going to be minor, as is the 3 and the 6. Except for the fact that there are plenty of songs that might use a major 2 chord or a major 6 chord. That's a particular sound, and I'll illustrate that in a minute. But right now, I just want to look at the way that these chords are coming from the scale. So let's say we take this fingering. So here's an A chord, which is just a piece of a big 5-note barred A, and then here's the scale. We can see where the chord tones are. Right here, here, here. Obviously F sharp and G sharp, both a level of tension, but it's so clearly pointing back up to our root. So check this out. If I'm just playing over A, like let's say I have an A vamp, right? So remember that a vamp is simply a repeating pattern that on a single chord, or not even a pattern necessarily, just repeatedly sitting on a single chord. So that would be this, and I'll play the major scale. Pretty straightforward. Now watch this. Anyway, you get the idea of what's going on there. And the vamp I was using was just an A5 vamp. It wasn't major, it wasn't minor. So I could easily work with a minor lick or a major lick. But what you might have noticed is that I pretty much use the entire chromatic scale. The chromatic scale is if you're hitting every note, not just the letters, not just the major scale. A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A. 12 notes in the chromatic scale. And then there's your octave. Now, we can classify these notes that don't belong to the major scale and look at how we're going to use them when we are working in a key like A major. So, if I take this, we've established that there's an A arpeggio here. And playing over an A chord, I might walk up the major scale. We know that the B has a level of tension, it's a passing note. But I can also, now, that's using a minor third. We've talked about mixing major and minor. But I'd also mention, when we brought this up before, that that passing note, even though it is a minor third, mathematically speaking, I don't think we perceive it as minor like we're in a minor key. I think we're perceiving it more of a leading tone to the major third. In other words, a sharp 2. 1, 2, sharp 2, 3. Because when I do it that way, the direction of it is so clear. So yes, it's a minor note, but I'm calling it a sharp 2 because of the way that I'm using it. Because I'm using it that connector note. That gravitational pull up towards resolving into C sharp definitely adds a lot of flavor. So sure, we can That's a very common one to use. That might be one of the most common connector notes to use, chromatic connector notes. So again, it is not in the key, not the major key anyway, but it sounds fine. We're just dealing with this mode mixture of minor and major that I've mentioned before. And not only that, we're very accustomed to this as part of the blues language, certainly to mix major and minor, and you have it in classical music too. It's not all that unusual. You have it in jazz all over the place. And in fact, using chromatics like this makes things feel jazzy pretty quick. Add the swing to it, and that pretty much locks you in, right? Stylistically speaking, that's definitely what it feels like. Let's look at some more notes of the scale, though, and see what else we've got available to us. You might be familiar with the distinction between a minor pentatonic and a blues scale, say. Oh, excuse me. Minor pentatonic. Blues scale. And that's a pretty familiar sound. You've heard lots of riffs. That's not in that one. But anyway. That was a flat 5. Root, minor third, 4, 5, flat 5, 4. So that note is a passing note between the 4th and the 5th. We could consider it a flat 5, we could consider it a sharp 4. Now, how the heck do you know which it's supposed to be? There are definitely conventions, sort of standards for the way you ordinarily classify notes. If you're in a major key, and you're using a key that uses sharps, like A major, which has 3 sharps in it, then probably you're going to refer, to most of these chromatic notes as sharps or naturals, depending on what you've changed, but it's not like it always works that way. It's a convenient and sort of simple way to look at it, to just say if you're going up, you're going to use a sharp. If you're going down, you're going to use a flat. That's not uncommon. That's not universal either. The main thing is that for the most part, educated musicians are taught not to mix sharps and flats, although that's not to say you couldn't have an E flat in the key of A. Every one of these rules is more flexible than you might initially think. And that's the whole trick. When you start learning some theory and you get that one person that goes, oh, well, you know, I don't want to know about, see, here comes my dumb guy voice. I don't want to know about that stuff. I got to stay pure, you know? Like so-and-so didn't have to know theory. Yeah, and? What's your point? How's it gonna hurt you to know more than you do? Okay? It's important to be able to fill in the gaps in your natural ability through understanding and comprehension. That's how you're gonna learn. That's it, right? So everything we've been talking about, of course you're here watching this series, so it's not like you have a bias against learning, you're taking a lesson or anything like that, but you know what I'm saying. You have to look at theory as a set of guidelines, as a set of possible instructions, but the key word is possible. You can break any rule you want to break, and if it sounds good, you probably haven't even broken a rule. Anyhow, I can call this note flat 5 or sharp 4, and it is convenient for me to simply say, like, my brain likes it much better if I'm going to do this. I'd be more likely to call this an E flat than a D sharp, because if I'm thinking in terms of a scale, often we don't want to duplicate letters if we can help it. It just sort of makes things clearer in terms of the up and down of the scale, because when you're looking at the letters, you're seeing alphabetical. And I think that's helpful, just in terms of like keeping things orderly in your brain, right? So, if I'm using this blues scale lick, A the root, C the minor third, D the 4th, E flat, the flat 5. Could we call it a sharp 4? Sure, but I'd more likely call it a sharp 4 if we're doing this. So if I did that, would I call it D sharp going up and E flat coming down? Probably not. I'd probably look to be consistent and call it D sharp both ways. Fact of the matter is, all that really matters, most of all, is that you understand what you're doing, and if you're trying to communicate with another musician, that they understand what you're saying. So anyhow, that sharp 4 or flat 5 is a very common note in the blues. It is the note that a lot of people will say makes the minor pentatonic into the blues scale. I think that's a simplistic way to look at it, but on the other hand, sometimes being that simplistic is the best way to go. Just organizing things. Here is X, this is what it is, this is how you use it. And it's a little too confusing maybe in the beginning to say, yeah, but there's all this other stuff you could do, but don't think about that. But I honestly do think that's the way to look at it. You learn something, you approach it with the idea that you're going to focus on this thing, but you're also aware of all the other ways that this thing fits into the big picture, just understanding that there's too many of those ways for you to get it all straight in a short period of time when it comes right down to it. Now, can we use the sharp 4 in a major key? I was illustrating the minor pentatonic. And the answer is sure we can. It's a dissonant note, though. Let's reinforce A major again. And by the way, you might want to notice that I'm reinforcing the key by simply playing the scale but making sure that I begin and end on the root. So you have that sense of arrival. This is creating the sonic framework in your head to hear A major. So if I play a fifth and you have educated your ear, that sounds like a fifth. This is important because let's say you had, oh, I don't know, F in your ear. And then I hit an E. Now you're hearing the seventh that needs to resolve. That's not what we want. I want A. Just by playing a little bit of a chord progression that's clearly in the key of A, you get set up in your ear to once again recognize A as your primary reference, as your root note, the note through which you understand the sound of all the other notes. Now that's a fifth and not a leading tone. So can I use a flat fifth? Ooh, there was the flat 2. I'll get to that. Sometimes it sounded better than other times, but watch this. Now, if I go and play this against my track, then this time I'm going to our straight A major, like we used, well, I used this earlier, I used it last week as well. And the chord progression is simply, as I walked you through before, 1 chord A, 2 minor, B minor, 4 chord D, and back to the 1 chord A. And as I said, I think you perceive this as a circle. It just goes around and around. You know where it's going once you've heard it a couple of times. So, A major track is like this, and I'll plug in that sharp 4. I use it a few different ways, and it's not like this is an absolute, okay? You can do all kinds of different things. It's not as if you're limited to having to use a note only in a particular way, but there are ways that sound better than others. So in this case, what I'm talking about is using that sharp 4 specifically as a connector between 4 and 5. And so depending on what's going on chordally, we're going to approach this in different ways. But let's say we were on the A. I can... and it sounds perfectly natural. If I stop... I mean, it's one thing if we've got a chord progression... There I just borrowed a chord that used that note. I'll talk more about that in a second. But the point is that that note has a very strong push or gravitational pull, however you want to think of it, a very strong desire, for lack of a better way to put it, to resolve up. Does it have to resolve up? No. But does it want to? Yeah, I would say so. Now, I tried a little bit of this too, but it's not wrong necessarily. But it can be just a little too if we do it like that. It'll probably work better in a minor key, actually. Let's do this. I'm going to mix up the major and minor pentatonics, and I'm going to incorporate the sharp 4 when I'm on the minor side. So let's listen to, say, for example, this vamp here. So now this is a minor key vamp. See, notice that sounded good with that half step. Just chromatic. And see, notice in the minor key, I can use C sharp as a passing note. It's weird clashing. But even that was interesting tension because you're hearing a minor 7th chord underneath. But that all worked very nicely. But you see that how you choose that note makes a big difference in whether or not it's going to sound like it belongs. Sorry, I'm just tweaking here a little bit. So far we've talked about the sharp 2 and the sharp 4. You could also think of it as flat 3 and flat 5, but again, I think that's a useful way, just depending on how it's being used. I say sharp 2 as opposed to minor 3rd down here because I really do think we hear it as sharp 2 when we use it in conjunction with the major 3rd, which has such a strong sound to it that I think it just takes over. This one, sharp 4 or flat 5. Another chromatic note that we might use a lot is a sharp 1 or a flat 2. There was that sharp 2. Now that's pretty straightforward, right? And you can see I'm just connecting. In this case, I plugged in the flat 6 or the sharp 5 too. And look at that. minor 7 or major 7. When I do it chromatically, it all works. Now, of course, I'm not playing over a track right now, but I think you can start to hear this idea of push and pull. So I'm going to play unaccompanied right now and really try to bring out the push, the pull, however you perceive it, but the way that we use those tension notes. And so I want you to pay attention to whether I'm using that note as a connecting passing note or if I'm emphasizing it to actually point us somewhere. So for example, chromatic passing note, chromatic passing note, passing note. But there, that flat 6 implies a minor 4 chord. If I use, say, a sharp 2, no, let's say a sharp 4. That note pointed us very, very clearly and very, very strongly to a new chord. That D sharp, the sharp 4 in the key of A, happens to be the third of a major 2 chord. Not that you hear this sound so often, it's a little old-fashioned. But you do hear it. It's not really uncommon at all to use a major 2 chord in lots of different styles of music. So now I'm going to imply that chord change. So this is taking the vamp, I'm sorry, not the vamp, but the chord progression, the circle that we've been using of A, B minor, D, and A. And this time I'm going to A, B major, D, and A. And listen for the chromatics. Maybe a little tricky. Maybe the second time through wasn't the clearest example, but like right there, I use the chord tone, I'm sorry, the scale tone, the D natural, as a passing note to lead me up to D sharp because it's working with our B major chord. It might seem like there's going to be a lot to memorize here, and there is, but there isn't. I mean, yes, there are particular things where you can say, oh, sharp 4 is part of the B major chord, and after a while you'll remember that, right? Or flat 6 makes for a minor 4 chord. There are particular patterns, but I think more important right now, from the perspective of improvisation, is just to recognize that essentially I'm doing a handful of different things with these chromatic notes. And so I'm either using them as passing tones, or as chord tones of a new chord, or as dissonant flavor on purpose. Right? When dissonant note. I think you can start to hear it, that these chromatic passing lines really make things so straightforward. And this is halfway a joke, because I've heard people say this, kiddingly, half, but it happens to be true, that if you're trying to make something sound jazzy, just start plugging in chromatics, and if you can't find the note that sounds good, just keep going until you do. So now, I should mention that what I just played was not strictly a chromatic scale, and it's not like you have to be absolute about it, but you should be aware of this. And I've been throwing around a lot of scale tones, numbers, and things like that. Hopefully, the work that we've been doing in this course so far is at least setting you up to understand what I'm doing and why. Right? Like, what is the purpose of thinking about scale tones? How do they relate to our chords? So we've been getting into all of that. And I'll reinforce once again that it's a ton of stuff to remember, and so you don't need to give yourself a hard time over how long it's taking you to get it. Take in a small piece at a time, but just know that you're always adding pieces to a larger puzzle, repeatedly, is really what we're trying to do. So keep that in mind. If you can relate these chromatics back to your major scale fingerings, if you can once again identify within the scale where we are skipping notes, where we are leaving space. So for example, even just within the first 5 tones of this A scale, I have my sharp 5 very conveniently. And if I make too big a deal out of it, it sounds funny. Right? But if I don't make a big deal out of it and just pass through it, and you notice that this is from chord tone to chord tone. In the A, I went from the 3rd, 4, sharp 4, 5. It's the beginning of the melody to Thelonious Monk's Blue Monk. Lots of chromatics in that. In fact, out of A major, 6th fret, I'm doing it in A major because it's a guitar key. It's going to be in B flat or F most of the time, but 3rd to the 4th to the sharp 4 to the 5, and then it goes from the 6 to the flat 7 to this major 7 to the root. Now, if we're thinking A, that is what's going on there. And it's a good chromatic walk. It sounds good over that one chord. So you see what I did there? I used the G really as the passing note, as the chromatic, because that's the one that's not in the major scale. My sharp 2, my sharp 5 or flat 6, my flat 2 or sharp 1. Now, there are more chordal implications than I want to worry about asking you to remember to start with these variations. You'll get to know them after a while. The big ones, I think, are recognizing the sharp 4 for a major 2 chord, but also not uncommon to have a major 6. Major 6 chord would be an F sharp major. So even if I that's believable, we could have that. Well, what does that do? If I go to an F sharp major chord, that's our 6. Remember that F sharp minor is the 6th chord if we're going diatonic. F sharp major has an A sharp. Be a sharp 1. So check this out. Now I just outlined a triad. So that's a piece of an F sharp major chord here in the 6th position, and I just played A sharp, C sharp, F sharp, which is just an inverted F sharp major triad, which is a perfectly good way to work over a chord, just to play the arpeggio, right? But where do you think that note's going? Do-da-da. Pretty clearly, right? Not at all unusual. 1, 6, 2 minor, 5. 5 augmented has the leading tone to the major third. You might be familiar, Allman Brothers. Right, that kind of thing. It's all the same idea. You add in these other altered chords, and altered is probably the wrong word because it's a jazz term and I don't want to confuse things. But you add in these chromatic notes either for the flavor of, or because we've introduced a chord that needs a different note. And anytime you alter a chord out of the diatonics, anytime you're using a note that's not in the major scale, then obviously we're going to, using a chord, that's not in the major scale, that's going to create an implication in the way you approach it, what notes you emphasize. Again, it feels like a lot of memorization, and it kind of is. If you were to just isolate a couple of things to play with, what I would suggest is that you start experimenting with adding chromatics to the major pentatonic. So that might be something like this. Let's review major pentatonic in this position. 5, 7, 4, 7, 4, 7. Root, second, third, fifth, major sixth, octave. A, B, C sharp, E, F sharp, A, and then there's your scale. So now I'm going to add sharp 1, minor third, major third. Look at that. That was a chromatic scale. That was every note. Here's do, re, mi, fa, sol. Here's chromatics. Does it still sound like it could be major? Well, yeah, it does. And then continuing up, let's see. And that probably would be my fingering here, would be to go middle, pinky, extend, and then slide up. So a little more movement, a little more extension to get the chromatic scale. And we're going to do it again from 5 to flat 6, 6, flat 7. So here's our chromatic scale fingering. Second octave. So notice some of these funny extensions. Double it up. You can refer to that in the tab to get the idea. There's your chromatic scale. Again, just recognizing that every one of those added notes, those notes that are not in the A major scale, is going to give you all kinds of nice flavor and color options, all kinds of nice passing tones, and notes that you can lean on when you're playing a chord that is using something outside of the scale. Now I'm going to go back to playing over my A major track, and this is the 1A, the 2 minor, B minor, the 4, D. And this time I'm going to be as chromatic as I can and try to illustrate both the straight up chromatic scale walk, number 1, the passing tone, sharp 4, sharp 1, sharp 2, things like that, and then also chord tones, neighbor tones. So check this out. Come on. Here we go. So. Flat 3. Sharp 1. Sharp 2. Chromatics. Some notes are trickier than others, but neighbor tones. Passing neighbor tone. Maybe that's a little funny over something so straight major, but that sharp 4 sounds really good. That's a little weird there, not as good. That flat 6 is great. So is the sharp 2. So is the sharp 1. And flat 6. And you might have noticed that I still did look to resolve on chord tones for the most part. This has to do partly with just keeping your improvisations organized and making the push and pull of your own use of tension, maybe not to line up exactly with that push and pull and the chords, but at least to try to connect your melodic phrasing so that when the cycle comes to the end of a pattern, your melodic ideas are coming to the end of a pattern. So, just to review, chromatic scale built off our A major 4th position form with the root here on fret 5 of string 6, and instead of this, we're gonna go 1, sharp 1, 2, sharp 2, 3, 4, sharp 4, 5. Notice my fingering. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 1. And then 5, sharp 5, 6, flat 7, 7. And I can use either in that setting because there's that push, right? Or however you want to think of it, but that sense of direction of movement towards that one chord. So, fingering, once again, 1, sharp 1, 2, sharp 2, 3, 4, sharp 4, 5, sharp 5, 6. See, I would still call this a flat 7 rather than a sharp 6. 7 and 8. 1, sharp 1, 2, sharp 2, 3, 4, sharp 4, 5, sharp 5, 6, sharp 6, flat 7, 7. You might ask, why are you saying that you want to call the 4 sharp 4, but you don't want to call the 6 sharp 6? Well, it has something to do with the chords that those notes go with, because the sharp 4 generally is implying that 2 chord, or it's implying a diminished, whoops, so Well, that wasn't so great. There it was, but you can certainly hear. Well, I didn't play diminished, dang it. Sorry, it should be this. Oh, I did do that. Anyhow, that's one of the strong implications. And you get that over the sharp 2 also. Say you have kind of a jazzy, the sharp 1. You've heard this before, which is 1 sharp diminished, 2 minor, and 5. So then I can 1 sharp. That works very clearly, and all I did was went from A major to A sharp diminished into B minor. Look at how nicely that flows. Chromatic leading neighbor tone, I jumped into it. And even this technique, it's called an enclosure. My target note was the G sharp. So I hit a half step above, a half step below, and back into it. It's a nice technique. Or can work with major seconds, but works best with chord tones, with stronger tones. Bottom line is, though, as I've said numerous times at this point, there's enough theory that you have to give yourself permission to just focus in on a couple of key points. Like, start learning how to use the sharp 4. Start learning how to use the minor third in combination with the major third, which is something we've talked about and will continue to do more. Over time, you'll get to recognize the context more easily. And you might sit down with your major scale fingerings and just see if you can plug in chromatics as well, just to see where it takes you. Okay. All right, well, I hope this concept is not terribly difficult for you. I mean, really, it shouldn't be. The idea is that you have more notes and more options available to you than you might have thought you did. And it's a question of knowing what some of these other notes are that we can put into the mix. And also, when do you... So keep in mind, like if I were to really try to give you an overarching concept here, it's just that the dissonant notes need to be approached and left in a way that makes them blend with the consonant notes. And so this concept of passing notes is really important. Okay, I think I know what's happening. Stand by. Okay, you had playback. I see what it is. Should have stopped. Okay, because this wasn't playing back. Okay, good. All right, well now I think we know what's going on there. That explains a lot. Okay. The dissonant notes need to be used as preparation for consonant notes. And the main thing to recognize is that the dissonant notes are dissonant because they create that tension. And you don't even need to hear a background to hear that, right? If you've got A major solidly in your head, and I hit a note that's outside, you're hearing that desire to resolve, no matter how dissonant the note is. You hear that wanting to resolve. So it raises a question, which scale should I learn first? And what is a way to play a melody which is in our mind on the fretboard? That's a very good question. I'm glad that you asked that. I really do like to use the major scale as a primary reference. And I say that because number one, it's so familiar, and number two, because you can reach all the other scales, or pretty much any scale, through understanding it through its relationship to major, the alterations that you would make in the chord in the scale to match whatever it is you're looking to do. And we've been talking about this all along, both in terms of this lesson with chromatics, but also talking about modes and how you can reach a mixolydian by lowering the seventh of a major. You can reach a Dorian by lowering the third and the seventh of a major. You could, if you are most familiar with minor pentatonic, you could go to natural minor next, because then you would have been doing something that we've done previously in this course, which is to take a pentatonic scale and simply add in the connector notes that have been left out. But because I think it makes sense to understand natural minor as both one of the modes of major, the sixth mode, the Aeolian, but also as an alteration to the major that we can take and lower the third and the sixth and the seventh. And then not only are you learning a fingerboard formation, and this is relating to the second part of the question about how you play a melody, we are also relating to the sonic, just in the sense that I played you the A scale before and said you're going to hear every dissonant note relative to what I just played. The same thing is going on here. In other words, you're comprehending those dissonant notes, the C natural, the F natural, the G natural, through what you hear in your head, whether you're aware of it or not, when you think of the 3, the 6, or the 7. This is more intuitive than it is conscious right now, and the whole idea is to make it conscious. Back to the question is, how do you get these things on the fretboard? It's going to be mostly about your ability to think of these different tones as colors. That's one thing. So knowing what a third sounds like so that when you imagine something in your head, you know what it already is. Now, granted, some of this stuff, when you hear good players, really is just about flow. Right? They're not thinking major third. But the thing is, when you absorb this stuff thoroughly, those sounds are absolutely in your head, whether you understand them mathematically or not. And because you have heard your favorite players treat these relationships in a certain way, you have a vocabulary in your mind of how this stuff is supposed to go, whether you actually think you do or not. And so the other thing that I would say is really, really valuable to be able to explore this is to sit and improvise on a single string and just reinforce your sense of near and far. And even if you're just randomly, I'm going to start from somewhere, I'm going to slide up and stop wherever. Well, where did I end? Okay. On a flat 2. Which sounds very different from, which is also very different from, but I've moved different degrees each time. And so when you're learning to get these melodies out of your head, one thing to do is to actually step away from the scale fingering so that you're clear on ups and downs, large increments and small increments, but to then also, as you're doing your scale practice, recognizing your 3, your 4, your 5, and so forth. The more you do that, the more you're reinforcing your intuitive sense of what's going on. That is what allows people to play solos. So it's a combination of exploring, mapping, developing your knowledge of the fingerboard, developing your knowledge of the sounds of those patterns on the fingerboard, and then just doing it again and again and again, but also learning solos by great players you admire because you want to get an idea of how that vocabulary is articulated. Those are the sounds that are already in your head. You might as well get them into your fingers. Now, excellent question. Progression I hear somewhat frequently is a 1, major 3, minor 6. All the time. That's a very common thing. I can think of a bunch of songs that do that. Part of the reason you hear it so frequently is that that 3 major is actually the dominant, the 5 chord of our 6. Excuse me. So in the key of C, the diatonic 3 is E minor. Make that major, we're changing G to G sharp, and now that's a leading tone to A, whether we're going to A minor or A major. So if we're in the key of C, remember we're dealing with all naturals, no sharps, no flats. The E major chord needs a G sharp. So there's a couple of things you could do with that. First of all, you could just aim for the G sharp over the E chord. Excuse me. You could just as easily aim for E. So I might do this, C, and that do, re, mi just follows C major. But then over the E chord, I might continue the scale. Now, I did borrow F sharp and G sharp. So the F sharp would ordinarily not be in the key of C either. But it goes so nicely with E major. Now, could I use the F natural and use more of an A harmonic minor here? Yes, you could, but it immediately gives you this very specific minor harmonic minor flavor. So if you want to use that, you can. But I can use the F sharp. Which gives us more of this dominant 5-1 resolution. So it's simply whether you want a stronger resolution here or more of the flavor. Personally, I feel like that's a little bit much, but the other thing to remember is that aside from that G sharp, everything else is in the key. So we can still stay on C major. I mean, in that case, I use the G natural right before the E major chord, and it still sounded fine. So the bottom line is, whenever you have a stray note or a chord that pops in there that's borrowing a note from another scale, sometimes all you need to do is identify what that note is. And it's very, very common for that note to be some kind of a lead, some kind of tone that's setting up what's following. Whether we've set up a 5-1 relationship, like a 3 major to a 6 minor, or a 6 major to a 2 minor, or a 2 major to a 5. It's all doing the same thing. That's setting up what we might call an applied dominant, a secondary dominant, a 5 of. In other words, it's just pointing to that chord the way that a 5 chord does. Can you talk about how players like Jerry Garcia use chromatics? Now you're speaking my language right there. Yes, very prevalent in Jerry Garcia's work. You would get a lot of these straight up chromatic runs where basically he was just filling in the steps in between 2 notes. Now that's an easy one. That's just using that flat 3 / sharp 2, but then it almost always was used as passing note, or very, very frequently, I should say. Just in the same way we've been talking about using those as passing notes. And you would get certainly other flavors, other modes, and things like that. The Grateful Dead used modal chord progressions all the time. In fact, I've got a course on the music of the Grateful Dead that you should check out if you're interested in this, because we get into it in great depth. But it's pretty much the same way any jazz player would use chromatics, any bluegrass player would use chromatics. And this is partly where Garcia is getting his, his sounds, his influences from. So this idea of looking for the passing tone, so even when you play a major scale, to identify where are my chromatic notes. But you will find that it's primarily connecting between things. But definitely you would hear this. That sort of thing. You mean this one? Remember, there are lots of these scales that have this kind of, depending on how you look at it, some people would say it has a Middle Eastern flavor or a Spanish flavor or an Arabic flavor or an Indian flavor, whatever it makes somebody think of. All those things are pretty much inaccurate to begin with, but we're in the ballpark. There are just a couple of dissonant half steps that give the scale this sound, and it's going to be in one of two places. It's between the 5 and flat 6, minor 6, but this major 7. So this is our harmonic minor. But you could get that effect too, or a related effect to sort of tie these questions together. Chromatics. So even if we're and that was just just fitting in, but also the fact that it's just pointing very strongly. As soon as I start going down, you know where we're going. There's also the use of the flat 2. You can mix them both, major 7 and the minor 2nd. Which is not really anything in particular, because a Phrygian wouldn't have. It's like Nirvana. But that right there, flat 2, major 3, there's a name for that. But when you're looking for that kind of exotic sound, you're playing with flat 6, major 7, or you're playing with flat 2, or sometimes even sharp 4, and getting these. It's more chromatics, really, strings of half steps. And you can still relate it back to major. It's all about controlling the direction, how you're leading the listener's ear. And, you know, if you're a fan of the Grateful Dead, you understand how well they did that, how well Jerry Garcia did that. If you're not, it's worth exploring, even do a little listening to some of the more open-ended jams, simply to hear an example of how a rock band can interact and play off each other without a roadmap. I know you think jam band, that's what that means, but there is a real jazzy interaction between the instruments, even if it's not a jazz vocabulary, and that's something I think every musician should be aware of in one way or another. Well, thank you guys very much. And next week, I will be broadcasting live from the Jam Play studio in Colorado, so I'm excited about that. And then we will wrap this up, the 10th week of Finding Melodies from Scales, the week after that. I hope you are enjoying this class. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I'll be back next week.